This is Of Men and Dragons, Book 1, Chapter 14 by DrBlackJack21. When Jack and Angela first met Shahar, they witnessed the gap between human and Argoon physiologies. Both realized standard human armaments might not have enough stopping power. Instead, they decided to use bullets with a hardened steel tip with a high explosive core. In theory, it should have been more than enough force to crack an Argoon's armor plating and cause significant damage to the flesh underneath. As Jack watched the fight between Shahar and Duljan, he wished Angela and himself had gotten in more practical testing against ballistic dummies. Now he just had to hope that what little testing they had done would prove sufficient. Looking down, Jack noticed his hands were shaking again, worse than they had before. He tried to will them to be still, force them to be calm, but that seemed only to make the shaking worse. And that was when Duljan scored a glancing blow against Shahar's shoulder, causing her to drop her sword. Jack started to raise the gun, but before he could get a shot, Shahar leapt onto the giant, burying her teeth into his neck. Jack lowered the gun again, telling himself he needed to trust Shahar more. After all, if she couldn't hold her own in this and the coming fight, they were both already dead. Looking back at the crowd of watching Argoon, Jack was doing math and not liking the result. Ideally, once he started taking shots, many of the hill people would break and run. But based on what he knew of Argoon, their fight or flight response was weighted heavily towards fight. Jack counted 23 Argoon in the camp. Even if Shahar was able to take out 4 or 5 after her fight with the club-wielding maniac, there would still be way more raiders than the 10 bullets Jack had in his magazine. That meant he'd have to stop and reload while being charged by several 8-foot-tall monsters that could move faster and leap further than any living human. No matter how he looked at it, there was no way he could think that he would kill all of them before they reached him, and his time was running out. Duljan looked like he was about to make one last desperate gambit. Jack had hoped Shahar was ready and able to deal with whatever it was. For the last time, Jack checked the safety on his gun. The end was rapidly approaching. Jack stopped breathing when he saw the trap Duljan had laid for Shahar. After throwing his club, he rushed in while she was still prone, hoping to take advantage of his greater strength. However, Shahar proved herself more than worthy of Jack's trust. As she fell onto her back, Shahar placed a hand beneath her, appearing to slow her fall. But her real goal was the blade she dropped earlier. Shahar pulled out the short sword and impaled the flying Duljan before he had any chance to react, ending his life and thus the fight. Everything seemed to slow down at that moment. As Shahar stood, Jack raised the gun and half-aimed it towards the watching Argoon. He waited until the first one started to rise, then sighted along the barrel into the center of mass of the lead Argoon and pulled the trigger. The result was everything Jack could have hoped for, and utterly horrific. Jack clamped down on the second observation and locked it away to be dealt with when he and Shahar weren't fighting for their lives. Jack aimed the gun at the next closest Argoon and pulled the trigger a second time. As the raider's chest turned to ruin, the spell that held everyone silent ended. Everything exploded into action. A couple of Argoon turned and ran, but not nearly as many as Jack had hoped. The rest split into 3 groups. About half of the original group ran right up the middle, towards where Shahar stood between the camp and Jack. The rest split into 2 groups, running to either side of Shahar, bypassing her and heading directly for Jack. As much as Jack wanted to fire into the group charging Shahar to save her, he knew that if he got himself overwhelmed, the Argoon that killed him would simply charge Shahar from behind, and they'd both end up dead. Instead, he had to trust Shahar again and focus on the ones coming for him. He took aim at the group to his left and opened fire. Shahar saw the groups heading to flank Jack, but she knew that they'd both end up dead if she split her focus now. So Shahar would simply have to trust Jack's earlier claim and deal with the group headed directly for her. She leapt back to the spears she'd planted into the ground. Grabbing a small spear in each hand, Shahar whipped around and used her momentum to aid in her throw as she aimed for the closest Argoon. Before the spear hit, Shahar shifted the second spear to her dominant hand and launched it at a second target. The first spear landed dead center in the charging Argoon, piercing him through his chest plate. The raider immediately collapsed to the ground. An Argoon following the dead man got tangled in the lifeless limbs and fell as well, not out of the fight, but slowed for a few precious seconds. The second spear didn't fly as true, and hit her target lower than intended. It impaled the raider through the leg, pinning him in place. While the wound might prove fatal, it would take time, and he was already working on removing the spear to get back into the fight. Shahar grabbed the third and longest spear and prepared to meet the raider's charge. Behind her, Shahar heard Jack's impossibly loud weapon firing again and again as Jack faced his own desperate fight for survival. One after another, Jack was able to take out the 5 Argoon charging from his left, but between every pull of the trigger, they seemed to close an absurd amount of ground. More ground was eaten up by the Argoon closing on his right during the agonizingly long half-second turn to target them. There were 4 Argoon charging on this side, and having kept count, Jack knew he had only 2 shots in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. With no other plan coming to him, Jack aimed and pulled the trigger again. Another Argoon felled. Their deaths were horrible, and yet still they charged. Jack pulled the trigger once more. As the next Argoon fell, he was close enough that Jack could see the brief look of surprise on the raider's face just before the light left his eyes and he collapsed into a boneless heap. Suddenly, the face of every Argoon Jack had just killed filled his vision. The same look of surprise was now on all their faces as, one by one, the light left their eyes. Shoving the unwanted vision aside, Jack aimed and fired one last time. This time his vision blurred, his arms rebelled, and his shot went wide. He'd failed. There were 2 Argoon left, and nothing he could do. As one of the Argoon raked its claws across Jack's chest, he fell. As the first 2 Argoon reached her, Shahar cracked the butt of the spear into the face of the first, dropping him as she broke his jaw. Reversing the spear's momentum and driving it forward, she forced the second to dive away lest he get impaled. Spinning the spear in a full arc, she copied a move from Dolgen by loosening her grip just enough to extend the spear a few inches, raking it across the throat of a third assailant that was trying to sneak into her blind spot. Shahar fell back a few paces, working her spear into a pattern designed to buy herself a moment while assessing her options. Of her 9 assailants, 2 were dead, 1 unconscious, 2 slowed and out of the fight for 3 to 5 seconds respectively. She needed to thin the group a bit more before the last 2 arrived. Otherwise, she'd be quickly overwhelmed. Absorbing the momentum of her backwards movement, Shahar braced and launched herself forward once more. She put her full weight behind the spear and drove it into the centermost assailant. She released the spear. Rather than wasting a few precious seconds wrenching the weapon free, she pushed it off of her victim's body and launched herself at her next target. She collided with him and latched onto his throat as she had Dolgen's. As the 2 tumbled together, they fell right into the middle of the 4 remaining Argoon. As the last 4 combatants closed around her, Shahar was out of weapons and out of breath. As Jack landed on the ground, he silently thanked Angela for the armor plates she'd weaved into his coat. The Argoon who'd taken a swipe at him had chipped and broke several claws on the armor. Jack knew it wouldn't buy him much time, so he had to act fast. Drawing his knife, Jack buried it to the hilt in the foot of the Argoon standing over him, pinning the raider to the ground. Rolling away, Jack regained his feet just in time to jump to the side of as the second Argoon leapt forward. All Jack could do was take advantage of his lighter build to repeatedly crawl, jump, and dive just out of the raider's encroaching reach. As he fell, for what seemed to be the dozenth time, Jack fumbled with his gun, trying to load his last magazine, only to drop it instead when he had to make a last-ditch attempt to avoid another downward swipe of the claws. Scrabbling on all fours, Jack continued lurching and crawling away. The Argoon, sensing an end to the chase, approached at a deceptively leisurely pace. As his hand shot forward to grab Jack by the throat, Jack threw a handful of dirt and sand into the raider's eyes. Taking advantage of his opponent's momentary blindness, Jack dove behind him, picking up the magazine from the ground as he passed. Slamming the magazine into place, Jack racked the slide and aimed for the back of the Argoon that was busy clearing his vision. However, before he could pull the trigger, the gun was ripped out of his hands. The first Argoon stood over him, holding Jack's bloody knife in one hand and his gun in the other. Jack froze as his mind tried vainly to think of something new. He was out of weapons, out of ideas, and out of hope. As Shahar looked around at her plight, she noticed the Argoon sneaking up unseen behind Jack as the human fumbled with his weapon. Knowing she only had seconds before she was finally overwhelmed, Shahar gathered what little energy remained and leapt at the Argoon whose leg she'd impaled. Seeing her coming, he readied the very spear Shahar had used to impale him. Shahar twisted in midair to the best of her ability, but he still successfully drove the spear through her left shoulder. Rather than pull away, Shahar gripped his arms and pulled herself closer, driving the spear's shaft further through her shoulder. Realizing what was about to happen, the Argoon now fought to push Shahar away, but either due to his blood loss or Shahar's greater desperation, she was able to reach him and tear out his throat with her teeth. Her body was near total failure, and her vision was blurring as Shahar tore the spear from her shoulder and threw it with the last of her strength. Her final task complete, Shahar collapsed to the ground. She wasn't even able to see if she'd hit her target. Jack's mind was running a mile a minute, but every possible action he could think of ended in his death. The Argoon standing over him licked its own blood off the blade before laughing as the raider shifted his grip to deliver a final downward thrust. As the Argoon drew its arm back, Jack closed his eyes and accepted the fact that he'd done all he could. Jack's first thought was that his biggest regret was leaving Angela behind. Jack believed that this was the only choice he could have lived with, but he wished there was some way to let Angela know what happened. Jack's second thought was, why am I still alive? Opening his eyes, Jack saw the Argoon standing over him, looking stupidly down at his chest, obviously wondering how a spear had come to be sticking out of him. Realizing he'd wasted a precious second in self-indulgent thoughts, Jack leapt to his feet, taking his gun back from the collapsing Argoon. Turning, he saw Shahar had collapsed to the ground with 3 more Argoon closing in for the kill. The Argoon knew his time had come, and he stood straight, staring Jack in the face while waiting for death. Jack found that he couldn't pull the trigger. Instead, he dropped his aim from his target's face to his chest, looking him in the eyes, and shouted a command. Run! The Argoon twitched, but stayed still. Jack shifted the gun further to point next to the raider's feet. He fired a shot into the ground before raising the gun again, his warning clear. Run or die. He stood, ready to shoot if the Argoon decided to attack, but something of his intent must have bridged the gap. At first, the Argoon backed away warily, keeping both eyes on Jack. As enough distance opened between them, Jack relaxed his aim a little more, and eventually the Argoon turned and ran. Jack stood there, frozen in place as he watched the last of the hill people disappear into the distance. His mind was numb. A part of him knew he and Shahar needed to get help, but that part seemed to be shouting at him from a great distance. Eventually, Jack lost sight of the raider. Looking down at the gun in his hands, Jack was overcome by waves of nausea and revulsion by the sight of the monstrous thing. He threw it as far away from himself as possible. The distant part of his mind told him he needed to keep the gun close in case there were more hill people nearby, but Jack could barely hear the voice anymore. Despite the pleasant warmth of the day, Jack suddenly felt intensely cold. Every inch of his body was violently shivering. Before long, he collapsed into convulsions and vomited into a nearby bush. Jack continued dry heaving long after his stomach had utterly emptied itself. It was as though his entire body was rebelling at what he'd done. Jack wasn't sure when it happened, but there was a presence sitting beside him and a calming hand on his back. Looking up through the tears that clouded his vision as he wiped the bile from the corner of his mouth, Jack saw Shahar sitting beside him. She looked worse than he'd ever seen. One arm hung limp at her side, and she seemed to have a cloth wedged into a deep wound to staunch the bleeding. Looking Shahar in the eyes, Jack broke the silence with a sad smile and a pathetic laugh. I bet none of the men of your village would react this way to what we just did. To her surprise, Shahar's eyes were not filled with mockery or even the pity Jack had feared. Instead, her tired smile spoke of an understanding and maybe even a little respect. If you'd reacted the way the males of my village would have, I would have taken the girl and left. You would have never seen me again. Instead, I am here beside you. Jack noticed his gun sitting beside Shahar. Following his glance, Shahar reached down, picked up the gun, and held it for a moment. This wasn't some honorable combat to be bragged about around a fire. This was a brutal act of violence and survival. Shahar held the gun out to Jack, who, in turn, was unwilling to touch it. Shahar continued, But remember, you weren't the one that decided to raid and murder a family. You weren't the one that enslaved a child. You did what you needed to, and in my opinion, you did well. Shahar placed the gun in Jack's unwilling hands. It's best if you don't leave this out where anyone can find it. Jack nodded and reluctantly holstered the gun. As he did so, Shahar stood and offered him a hand. As she lifted Jack to his feet, Shahar reminded him why he had done this. Now there's a young girl down there we need to set free. Stay near me in case any of the hill people return. Neither of us is in any condition to fight anyone alone. As the two walked through the camp, Jack noticed the signs of ruined lives in the form of things that didn't belong. A finely crafted stein, a beautiful rug, even a child's doll. Jack knelt before the toy, wondering if it belonged to the girl they'd fought for, or if it belonged to someone else they'd arrived too late to save. Lost in thought, Jack picked it up before following Shahar to a tent. Inside the tent was the battered and bruised child. When she looked up at them, it was with eyes resigned to a horrible fate. She didn't even flinch as Shahar worked to remove bindings that had been tied so tight that they cut into her skin. The whole time Shahar spoke soothing words, while Jack stood off to the side. It's okay. You're safe now. They won't hurt you anymore. We're going to take you away from here. On and on she spoke, using her voice to try and soothe the child. Looking more closely at the girl, Jack could see the girl only came up to his chin. She wasn't as young as he'd first thought. She might have been a rough equivalent of 14 or 15, though he couldn't be sure. Once she was free, the girl simply stood in place, looking at Shahar as if waiting to be told what to do. Looking at Jack and seeing he was as lost as she was, Shahar decided to lead the girl outside. Once outside, the girl shielded her eyes against the glare of the midday sun. She seemed to be standing in place again. That was when Jack noticed she was staring at a body. The body of the first Argoon Jack had shot. Slowly, the girl turned around until she was looking at Shahar. She pointed at the body and spoke for the first time. Did you do this? Shahar looked at the body, then to Jack, then at the girl. No, I did not. The girl turned to face Jack this time and repeated her question. Did you do this? In a few seconds, Jack thought of a dozen comforting lies and 100 justifications. Instead, he simply nodded his head yes. With a blur of speed neither of them thought she was capable of, the girl launched herself at Jack, her arms stretched wide and claws ready to attack. Jack had just enough time to wonder dumbly if the body was someone the girl had known, and then she was on him. She tackled Jack with enough force to launch him off his feet. The girl's vice-like grip was strong enough to crack a rib. As he fell to the ground, Jack found he didn't have the heart to defend himself. Jack was lying on the ground for several moments before he noticed the girl wasn't attacking. She was sobbing. Her head was buried in his chest, and she was whispering 2 words over and over. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Jack had never been comfortable with physical contact, but the girl's desperation called out to an old pain of his own. He sat up, wrapped her in his arms, and held her while the girl continued to sob. Shahar knelt beside the pair and put a comforting hand on the girl's shoulder. The 3 of them stayed like that until the girl cried herself dry.